Ladies and gentlemen, now we would like to begin session 1 on cybersecurity. So now we would like to begin the 2022 World Emerging Security Forum session 1 under the theme of ongoing battles in cyberspace. In this session, we will have a keynote speech and a panel discussion followed by the Q&A session. We welcome questions from our online participants, so please leave your questions or any comments in the YouTube comment box. And the participants here at the site can find their questions through the QR code that you can find on the forum leaflet. So please feel free to leave any of your comments or questions. And after having a discussion session, we'd like to have the Q&A session, and we will try very hard to answer your questions. Then, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please allow me to invite Mr. Christopher Painter, who is the president of the Global Forum on the Cyber Expertise Foundation, and also the former coordinator for cyber issues at the U.S. State Department. So now he's joining us in real time via Zoom to have his keynote speech. And he will be also staying with us at the Q&A session as well. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you, and it's truly great to be with you. I wish I was there in person. I wanted to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, especially during my time as a diplomat. I had many warm receptions and discussions with my counterparts there. And certainly Korea has been on the front edge of thinking about cyberspace issues for many years. And also it's important, the conference you're having on the World Emerging Security Forum, there's certainly almost no more emerging security challenge than in cyberspace. Now, it's been a big year for both cyber threats and for cybersecurity and our response more generally. The rise of cybersecurity as a real national security priority, I think we've witnessed it this last year. For many, many years, I've been doing various cyber things, first as a prosecutor, then at the White House, and then as a diplomat for about 30 years now. And I think finally, as many of us had hoped, cybersecurity has reached the top of the world stage as a priority, occasioned by two things. One, malicious ransomware attacks, in particular in the US, the Colonial Pipelines attack that caused people to have to wait in line for gas, attacks on food distribution systems, and attacks on healthcare systems, all raise this to not just a theoretical issue for ordinary people, but something that actually hits them where they live, and that translates into a political priority. And on the other is the war in the Ukraine, the invasion, the unlawful invasion into the Ukraine, and how cyber has been used in that conflict. Now, there is a debate about how much we expected to see cyber being used in that conflict, how much we've seen cyber to be used in that conflict. And I'd say that the fact is we have seen it, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We've seen very significant uses of cyber attacks, cyber threats in that conflict and potential use of cyber in the future. I think partly the debate about whether we've seen as much cyber as we expected is because often people talk about this issue in hyperboles. There are phrases in the US like cyber 9/11 and cyber Pearl Harbor. These are phrases I've always hated, I still hate. And hopefully we've moved away from those kinds of analogies because it creates this expectation that that's the only kind of thing we're going to see in cyberspace, the kind of cyber calamity, where in fact, when we don't see that, people say, well, people said this is going to happen, it didn't happen, we don't have to pay attention to this issue. And that would be a grave mistake, because what we see every day, both in the Ukrainian war, but also just in our everyday lives, is a myriad of criminal cyber attacks, criminal and nation state intelligence gathering operations, and even nation state disruptive attacks as well, and blending between all of those. So cyber is and continues to be very important. And if we only think about those catastrophic events, I think we're really missing the point. And the Ukraine is a good example because we have in fact seen infrastructure attacks by Russia. We saw an attack on what's called the Viasat system, which was a command and control satellite system that Ukraine used just before the physical war began. And again, this is something that you expect to disrupt command and control before an invasion. We've seen continuing attacks on infrastructure, on other communication lines, other uses of cyber in a destructive way, but also, of course, to gather intelligence. Microsoft put out a report about this, and just recently, one of the folks you're going to hear from during the panel, the Cyber Peace Institute, put out a compendium about attacks that are happening, cyber attacks that happen in Ukraine. So this narrative that we're not seeing cyber is just frankly wrong. We are seeing it. Now, what we are seeing is two things, though. One is that, the fact is you're not going to use cyber to destroy infrastructure when you have tanks and guns and soldiers on the ground. It's much more efficient to target an infrastructure physically than it is with cyber. It's easier to do it, frankly. So it shouldn't be a surprise that once the attack was actually launched, a lot of what we're seeing is in the physical world, but it's being enhanced by activity in the physical and the cyber world. Now, to be sure, just like in other areas of the conflict, perhaps the aggressor has not matched up its cyber activities with its physical activities as well as they could have, and we're lucky they haven't. But we're seeing more and more of that as well. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that we've seen quite a bit of cyber resilience on the part of the Ukrainians, and that is due to a couple of different things. One, as the Ukrainians like to say, while you are all preparing for cyber events, cyber conflicts, cyber attacks by going through tabletops or exercises or things to try to figure out how you do this, they have been living this day to day for many years now. There have been many other Russian and other nation state attacks, but predominantly Russian, on, for instance, power grids and other things, and they've been dealing with that. Coupled with that, there has been a lot of capacity building in the Ukraine, capacity building to help with their cyber capacity, their policies, their tools. The US and many other countries have been doing this. Capacity building is indeed what my organization, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, is all about. Capacity building is important for the Ukraine, but it's really important for all the rest of the world. And one lesson I think we can draw from what we're seeing in the Ukraine now is that this issue is continue to be an important issue, and we need to help countries around the world prepare for it. We need them to have the policies in place. We need them to have the institutions in place like national certs, national strategies, response plans, and we need to engender that kind of collective response that we need. So we've seen all those things. And then one of the issues I think that we have to look at is the various hybrid threats that we're seeing. I talked about what's happening in Ukraine, so what people would call in the theater of operations. And we are indeed seeing cyber there. But there was also a fear that we would see cyber being used to retaliate against the West, against Korea, against others who supported sanctions against Russia or other measures to impose consequences on Russia for this unjustified attack. And we have not seen that in real force yet. But the message here is don't think that it's all past. Don't think that we're past that. I think it's still very likely as the war goes on that you will see those kinds of attacks against our infrastructure, against other facilities in the US, in Korea, and really around the world. So what I'd say there is watch this space. In the US, our cyber infrastructure agency and our Department of Homeland Security has this phrase that they've used, shields up, meaning put your shields up, be prepared because it's coming. And that means that governments need to be ready for it. The private sector needs to be ready for it. We need to work in tandem to do this. Now, we've seen the private sector be incredibly effective, even in the Ukraine, in terms of things that, for instance, Google has done about taking down some of its mapping services, things that Microsoft and other parties have done to work with the Ukrainians to help them with cybersecurity. So that actionable connection between the private sector and government is critically important as we go forward, and we need to continue to do that. So we have those kinds of lessons, or those kinds of attacks in Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, potentially still. We also have disinformation, and that is a whole different area. It's related, but a different area. And certainly we've seen that being used extensively in the Ukraine, but also outside the Ukraine to try to win the hearts and minds of other countries, other populations to justify this unjustifiable invasion. So we see all of those things together, and I think it's a good template for the discussion that we'll see here. So finally, I just want to link this to the ongoing discussion, the diplomatic discussion of cyber norms, international law, and cyberspace, how those things work together. As many folks in this audience know, there's been an extended discussion over a number of years that international law applies in cyberspace just like it does in the physical world, although it's still working out the details. And there are certain norms of responsible state behavior that apply in cyberspace. Norms like don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country, don't attack the certs of another country, to provide assistance if your country is being used as a launching point by criminal or other groups, due diligence norm, if you will. And unfortunately, even though all the countries, including Russia, have agreed to these norms and agreed that international law applies, that doesn't mean we see compliance with it. And what we see, especially in the Ukraine conflict, again and again, just like we see in the physical rules that are dealing with physical conflict, those rules are continually being violated. And even before the Ukraine conflict or the Ukraine war, we've seen a lot of these rules flouted. You know, people agree to them, but then they don't uphold them. So what does this mean? And we've also seen, we've seen this be done with some impunity, and we've seen nation states and others calling out countries for transgressions, joint attribution. That's very good, but we need more of a collective response. So the biggest missing piece to me is accountability. How do we make accountability work? How can we collectively get together, nation states, the private sector, and others, to hold bad actors accountable? So in the end, we make cyberspace a more secure and stable place for all of us. That collective engagement is really important. That's true for nation states. It's true for cybercrime. There's activity now in the UN about a new cybercrime treaty, but we need to make sure not just we agree on rules, but we enforce it. Because the ultimate goal for all of us, and I'm here in The Hague in the Netherlands, I'm looking at the Peace Palace out my window. And it really reminds me that when we're talking about cyberspace as a domain of war, I don't think it's a civilian domain. Yes, it's used for warfighting purposes, but ultimately it's a place where we need to make sure that we're continuing to promote peace and security. And the only way to do that is collective action among all of us, all of our states, all of our private sector and others in service to this rules-based order that makes us all secure. Yes, we're going to see cyber conflicts in the future. Yes, we're going to see these activities being done on this platform, but let's try to preserve the civilian peace in cyberspace and build that long-term stability by not just agreeing to rules, but enforcing those rules. And also making sure that countries have the capability and capacity to do that. And with that, I thank you. I look forward to the panel discussion and the question and answers to come.
Thank you so much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will start the panel discussion. We are joined by Dr. Alina Lennon, Adjunct Professor of Political Science and National Security at University of New Haven, who will be our moderator. So please come up to the stage. And next, we'd like to have Mr. John Hallquist, Vice President of Mandiant Corporation. Please come up to the stage as well. And last but not least, we do have Dr. Stephen Waldheim, a Senior Fellow of the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Please come up to the stage. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome them with a big round of applause. Thank you so much. And we do have online a panelist, Mr. Stefan Duygen, CEO of Cyber Peace Institute, is also joining us via Zoom in real time. Thank you once again for your time today. So with that, I would like to pass the microphone over to our moderator, Ms. Lennon. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Good evening. First of all, let me thank Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea for hosting this very important forum and for extending the invitation to me in particular. I'm delighted to be among such esteemed experts, and I'm looking forward to a very productive conversation. As you all know, Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, ongoing war against Ukraine, has not only killed thousands of people and displaced millions, but also led to tectonic shifts globally, both when it comes to global security, but also food and energy security, as many of our speakers have pointed out before. But aside from that, Russia has also introduced a new realm of cyber operations that sometimes accompany kinetic military activity on the ground to disrupt, destruct, spread information, disinformation, and also to conduct cyber espionage against Ukrainian government agencies. The danger that comes with that is that these cyber operations are not only limited to Ukraine, that they can potentially spill over and affect other countries as well, as we have seen in the last 3 months, but also over the course of the last 8 years that the war has dragged on. So given the evolution of cyberspace as its own operational domain and as a theater of combat operations, it is incumbent upon us to rethink cybersecurity, and in particular how emerging technology can be weaponized to not only augment military activity on the ground, but also affect daily activities of civilians and private actors. And like I said, I couldn't think of better experts to help us address those questions and to think of lessons that we have learned so far when it comes to the use of cyber capabilities, both against government targets and civilians as well. And I would like to first invite our first speaker to give us his assessment of the situation on, in terms of what we have learned so far from the Russo-Ukrainian war, and also how the use of cyber capabilities, particularly in Ukraine, has changed the landscape and has affected the way in which we should be preparing for threats in the future. And I would like to invite Mr. Hallquist to give us his assessment of the situation first.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. We began tracking this threat or really worrying about this threat at the beginning of the year. We started preparing our customers with briefings. We kicked up our intelligence collection efforts in Ukraine and elsewhere against Russian threat actors, and we really saw 3 types of activity. We've been tracking 3 types of activity. The first one is the espionage problem. It's never going away. It's always there. But we saw, a significant amount of espionage coming against, particularly in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. Actors from the GRU, for instance, were very busy within Ukraine trying to gather that information, particularly military-related information, diplomatic information. And we saw other actors like the SVR outside of Ukraine gathering information. You can imagine diplomacy. They want to know what other countries are thinking. We saw disinformation efforts ramp up. So really, these range from the real simplistic troll farm stuff you see in the social networks, all the way to the more complex operations that actually involve things like hacking and leaking things, creating fabricated information. We've seen all sorts of different narratives pushed within the context of this. So you'll see narratives like the Ukrainians are capitulating or quitting, being pushed, sort of anti-war Ukrainian war effort narratives. Stories like the Zelensky has committed suicide, or the army or the military is giving up. We see stories that are designed to essentially attack the alliance. This is something that they're really pushing hard against. So, for instance, a Russian actor fabricated a map, and that map was supposed to be essentially of Polish units moving into Western Ukraine, suggesting that they were going to then carry out what was essentially a military annexation of Western Ukraine in the name of like a safety buffer. And we've seen this stuff even target the Russians. We know that they are carrying this stuff out against their own population, where they are pushing disinformation there too. But I think the thing that people worry most about, and the thing that we're most worried about, are the disruptive, destructive cyber attacks. We've seen some major ones. I think the Viasat incident was a really big deal. It was one of the few incidents I think was really well carried out really well in conjunction with some of the ground or the ground invasion. But we've seen, we've also seen an attack on the grid or an attempted, excuse me, an attempted attack on the grid. But we've also seen a lot of sort of isolated wiper incidents. We've seen, I've been tracking particularly the GRU actors for a long time. Some of these incidents are certainly, I think, a big deal, but not at the scale that we've been really concerned with, right? We have been really worried about a much bigger scale incident and that could have greater effects. We haven't necessarily seen a lot of those yet. I think what we're most concerned about is an incident where these actors are able to hit a lot of targets simultaneously, and that they generally do that through supply chain or critical infrastructure. And we haven't seen them pull that sort of operation off yet. And I think we've also recognized that there are a lot of limitations to cyber within the context of war. When bombs are flying, a lot of cyber capabilities are high. They're really just there to create psychological effects, and it's kind of hard to have a psychological effect when people are dying and all these terrible things are happening on the ground. Cyber is somewhat limited. A lot of the effects that we see from cyber are reversible and they're non-lethal. I think that those limitations actually make it a good tool for use outside of Ukraine. The question we've been asking ourselves for quite a long time is, what's going to happen outside of Ukraine? And even though cyber does have these limitations, those limitations may actually be of value for the Kremlin right now. They are probably looking for a way to retaliate. They're under enormous pressure, right? Everything that they had planned for clearly didn't come to fruition. The allies have been stronger than ever. NATO is making all kinds of new moves. There are weapons shipments going on. There's talk of even U.S. participation in some of the cyber activities. They're probably under a tremendous amount of pressure. And they're looking for a tool that will allow them to respond without necessarily starting World War III. And because cyber is often non-lethal, right, and it's usually reversible, this is an excellent tool for them to sort of signal their resolve. And so I don't think we're out of the woods entirely yet. I still think this is a good tool for not just within this conflict, but outside of this conflict.
Thank you so much for those insightful remarks. And I think just to your point about Ukraine actually conducting offensive operations in cyber and in the physical domain is really on point here in terms of that capability evolving to where Ukraine can be effective in combating and preventing those operations. Our next speaker hails to us from Switzerland remotely. Stefan Dugin, please, the floor is yours, and if you can please give us your assessment of the situation, and particularly the work that you have done on how cyber attacks affect civilians and civilian infrastructure, not just in the Russo-Ukrainian war, but in general.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to connect. Apologies, I could not come to Seoul. I would have loved that, but let's say that's a pandemic that is not a cyber one decided otherwise. It's truly a pleasure also to address these specific topics because as you hinted towards this in the Cyber Peace Institute. So we are a non-for-profit, an NGO in Geneva. We looked into the reality of cyber operations, cyber attack since the invasion, but in fact already before the invasion, and to look into, and it was mentioned before, and I like the fact that we could look into that aspect of the problem. We looked into the societal and human harm of the attack, which are really the ones that are defining the problematic here. So there's been Chris mentioned that in the keynote. kind of a expert assessment that okay, cyber is not such a thing in the context of this conflict. We push back on this clearly, sharing with the audience a public platform that we put in place. So you can find this on the website of the Cyberspace Institute. It's a public resource where you can see the number of attacks, of campaigns of attacks which are raging since the invasion. We are in more than 220 campaigns targeting more than 19 different sectors. And in fact, the impact is not happening only in Ukraine or in Russia. It's happening in various countries, and more than 20 countries have been impacted by the ripple effect of these attacks. And I like what was said just before in terms of looking at the impacts. How can we seek the impact? If they have not been like destructive to the scale that some, predicted it to be, still the long-term effects and the psychological effects is to be looked into. So that's this work that we're doing in the Institute is trying to look into what is happening since the invasion, how these different type of attacks are working with each other, and how are they to be analyzed in the context of the kinetic warfare. So we look at those specific types of attacks. This is the wiper, it was mentioned before, so attack to destroy the system, attack to disrupt access to specific services by the civilian population, and that's our focus. Our focus in the Cyberspace Institute is to look into the impact on civilian population and civilian objects in a time of peace and today in a time of war. So we look at all these attacks that prevents population to access finance, communication, refugees, humanitarian services that have been severely hit since the beginning in their capacity to be operational in the front line. So that's quite important in terms of impact. It was mentioned before. I like the fact that we look into this as a holistic threat. The disinformation landscape is not only attack on system; it's attack on cognition. It's really trying also to destroy the trust or the capacity to trust and to look into the reality of the warfare. And we saw that again in the humanitarian sector, also trying to cast discredit on humanitarian operation so that refugees would not use these type of services. And espionage was mentioned. Thank you for this campaign in order to steal data and survey in order to gain intelligence. Something that we see is that this invasion had a very profound impact on the mechanic of warfare. I would say it's a defining moment, specifically how cyber is weaponized in the context of warfare, because it changed how you look at the conflict in different angle. First, in the time of the war, when the war started, is quite interesting. Because a lot of activities that have been happening before the invasion are directly useful for the conduct of military operations. So I say if you look into the cyberspace part of the problematic, it also even question, the date when this war started. The second bit is where is the warfare? So clearly, it's not only in within the border of Ukraine or within Russia. It's with the fact that capabilities is not so complicated to use and to enact from anywhere in the world to conduct an attack against military targets, potentially civilian targets in the context of this conflict, is changing also where the war is happening. And when we talk about this, we also talk about, who takes part of this war. It's also profoundly changed. But the fact that, call for volunteering has been put out, answered by Ukraine, clearly, but also by people, left and right on the planet that decided to participate in a way to this conflict. What is their certainty that when they conduct a DDoS operation or something similar, that their target is solely military? There's no map of cyberspace. There's no map of this is military, this is civilian, and it's really easy, to navigate between everything. It doesn't work like this. So it's quite dangerous, this kind of escalation of everyone can participate. And that's not only when it comes to a collective of volunteers. I'm thinking criminal groups. The public position that have been taken by criminal groups stating that their operation, criminal operation, are going to be done with a geopolitical agenda is blurring also the line of what kind of legal framework you put in place to look into this. So is this criminal law or is this, the law of conflict? So that's really a defining moment in history in how cyber suddenly participate to the escalation of the threat. I would say we should never forget that a interesting and I guess useful way to assess these campaigns of attack over time is looking at the impact on civilian population. And this so far is still under evaluated. We have a tendency to assess, impact or danger when it comes to the military impact of operations. But we, Cyber Peace Institute, we are specialized into providing for free cybersecurity help to humanitarian sector way before the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And we see that clearly this sector, the humanitarian sector, the one in the front line, the one that are servicing the civilian population, are impacted by this destructive, this disruptive, this disinformation campaign. So happy to take more questions about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that holistic overview of different cyber tools, but also reminding us that at the end of the day, those are only tools, right? I mean, they have become more sophisticated, but political objectives still underlie those operations and those attacks. Unfortunately, civilians get caught in the middle. And I particularly appreciate your point about Russia disabling satellite networks at the beginning of the war to prevent or to disable command and control centers in Ukraine, and that also affected the rest of Europe. So what happens in Ukraine does not, even in cyberspace, does not stay in Ukraine. And I think it's a very important reminder. Thank you so much for that. Last but not least, to help us situate this this conversation into a more global geostrategic perspective, we have Stephen Wertheim, who will provide us with a sort of broaden the conversation to situate again this particular conversation of cyber capabilities into a bigger picture of what the future of war looks like, and perhaps what effect it will have on geopolitics writ large. Please, the floor is yours.
All right, just a small question. I'm sure I can do justice to it in a few minutes. Thank you for that, and I'm delighted to be here and with this panel. I think the war in Ukraine sheds light on a running debate that's been going on about just how important cyber methods will be in warfare. One position in this debate has been encapsulated by that unfortunate phrase, a cyber Pearl Harbor. It suggests that cyber conflict can have major effects independent of the use of force, so it could even substitute in its destructive potential and its effects for the use of force. Another position sees a more limited role for cyber, but sees it as a significant complement to kinetic activity. And to my mind, what we see so far, and we should emphasize so far in the war in Ukraine, mostly validates the latter point of view. And in fact, it might even suggest that we really need to ask difficult questions about just how significant the cyber operations we've seen have proved to the outcomes to date in the war in Ukraine. And that's precisely because there have been so many cyber attacks coming from both sides in the conflict, so it's not for a lack of effort. You know, if that's the case, why might that be? One thing has to do with what Chris pointed to. It's the role that cyber attacks play physically. They don't cause destruction directly. Cyber attacks are good for disruption, but they work by exploiting vulnerabilities in networks. So unfortunately, human beings know efficient ways to kill each other, and we're seeing that play out in Ukraine. So it's much easier, if a state is willing to do it, to send a missile to blow up a building than to try to disable the activities of the building by hacking the systems in the building. But I think even more importantly, war is politics by other means, as Clausewitz would have it. So when we evaluate the role of cyber attacks, specifically in warfare, as an instrument of warfare, I think the question we ultimately have to ask is how effective are cyber attacks in achieving the larger political goals that the state is pursuing. And if we take the Viasat attack, which I agree was a very significant attack at the beginning of the war, the basic story is that Russia utterly failed to attain its initial objectives in the war, even though the Viasat attack did cause disruption with communications in Ukraine and even had the ripple effects that you mentioned, Elena, such that it turned out that 5,800 wind turbines in Germany were shut down. This attack matters, but it certainly didn't allow Russian forces to attain the objectives they were seeking. The basic problem for the Russians was Putin's fundamentally incorrect assumption that Ukraine wasn't a real country and was going to roll over when Russian forces came into Kiev. Then we had the failure of the Russian armed forces to enact combined arms operations, as their doctrine might suggest. And that, I think, does a lot more to explain why the war had the outcome it did in the initial phase. Now we've turned to a different phase in the war, and we will have to see to what extent cyber operations impact the outcome there. But I would say at a first blush, we're looking at a war of attrition where some really classic questions of manpower, ammunition, and so forth are the most important, seem to be the most important questions going forward. So if that's so, what might it mean for the future of warfare? Well, I would say that we've seen a trend over the last several decades towards the dominance of defense relative to offense. It's true in the land and air and sea domains. And that's for a number of reasons which have been on display in Ukraine, including the ability of precision-guided long-range munitions, missiles, and drones to obstruct offensive attacks. It's also due to factors like urbanization, which I think matters in Ukraine and will matter elsewhere. But perhaps we're seeing something rather similar emerge in the cyber domain. And I have to stress how utterly early it is, unfortunately, probably in this particular conflict, to be drawing conclusions. But at least I want to say that as of now, I think we've seen the ability of Ukraine to mount an effective cyber defense for a whole host of reasons. And so I think that should make us look back on some of the prognostications that have been advanced over the years with some skepticism about how cyber warfare can provide a real advantage to the offense because it opens up opportunities for new attacks at a minimal cost because the attacker doesn't have to take the risk of sending in armed men. Perhaps we're seeing, if not the dominance of the defense, then at least a demonstration that the defense can be effective and that at least the dominance of the offense is in fact not in play in the cyber realm, and that ought to make would-be attackers think twice, think 3 times, hopefully, about whether they believe that they will truly gain from launching attacks in the kinetic and the cyber realm. This is not, to be clear, an argument for complacency, just the opposite. It shows that a prepared and capable cyber defense might just be able to get the job done. So I'll just leave it there and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for those remarks and for situating this conversation into a bigger conversation about future warfare. Before we turn to Q&A, I'd like to have a lightning round with all the panelists here and change the conversation a little bit and focus on solutions. So what are some of the innovative solutions? Perhaps new ways of public-private cooperation or collective response coordination measures that you can think of in addressing these new challenges. And in particular, if you can comment on the existing rules and norms in whether it's the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime or the United Nations Ad Hoc Committee on Cybercrime, how effective those organizations have been, and what are some of the missing pieces of that puzzle? What should we be creating by ways of new collaborative efforts and rules and norms? If I could just have everybody maybe speak for about 2 minutes each on solutions to the current challenges before we turn to Q&A, that would be great. And we can start perhaps in the reverse order with Mr. Painter.
Thanks. Well, I think I addressed this a little bit. I don't think the ad hoc committee, that's just beginning really to look at a cybercrime convention. So I think that might address some of these issues on the criminal side. I think it's more the norms that have been agreed to on the UN side. And one of the things that I think is a solution is that we don't think of cyberspace in a bubble. We think of cyberspace as part and parcel of geopolitics. So when we want to put pressure on a country to obey the norms in cyberspace, it's just not the cyber tools we use or the cyber people who do it. It has to be part and parcel of our foreign policy and our relation with that country. The other thing I think that the Ukrainian war has illustrated is how quickly like-minded countries have come together in support of Ukraine. And I think that also helps us in cyberspace in terms of building this collective arrangement, more collective participation and cooperation. I think that's going to be a key going forward, and not just between states, but also with other stakeholders like the private sector.
Thank you. Mr. Hallquist?
Well, I think we may have missed some opportunities before. We're getting better at it. I think one of the solutions is to be very forward about what is going on, what has happened. In this country, there was a major cyber attack by the GRU against the Olympics, the opening games of the Olympics. So this is an attack on the global community, and we didn't really start talking about who did it for years after. When we fail to call these things out, we are telling these adversaries, in the future, they're going to be able to get away with these things, right? And so we have to start paying forward now. We're exposing these things, and at the very least we can do is call out these adversaries when they carry out these attacks. There is no chance of deterrence or keeping norms, maintaining norms if we can't even bother to accuse them when they do this stuff.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Dugin, please.
Yeah, sorry, my mic was cut. To the last point, yes, attribution is central and key. So to demonstrate that norms and rules can be put into operations. The issue, we see this in the context of warfare, but also with other attacks, is very difficult to have an attribution process which is happening in a time that is useful for the victims, the communities, because you have a very fast attribution which is political and where it's very questionable because you don't know which data are behind, or you have a real attribution process which is on the basis of data, forensic examination. It takes quite some time. But investment there, I totally agree, should be done. You're mentioning something that could be seen as a new tools, a new approach, the volunteering. So I mentioned, how bad it can go, but we can also mention how good it can be. So we could welcome the capacity of volunteers since the beginning of this crisis, already before, people coming from the private sector in a program that we put in place with these actors to help for free, humanitarian actors, which are, in the front line of crisis, and this crisis demonstrated the need. So you have humanitarian sector that are in need of capacity for cyber resilience to be more in capabilities. You're mentioning before cyber defense. So to defend their ecosystem, their perimeter, their beneficiaries. And sadly, when they've been attacked, they're also in need of capacity, to recover. And this we demonstrated via a program that volunteers left and right in the world who wanted to do something after this invasion could be proposed with a tool that makes sense for their capabilities. So there's space to invest and to invent into this field.
Thank you so much for that insight. Last but not least, so wartime.
Sure. Well, I think this is a problem that requires responses from really all levels of society, and that goes for international society as well. I think there are some things governments don't necessarily need to do so much. For example, it would be wonderful if we could see the development of a private insurance market for firms when it comes to cyber crime, acts that are not really political or part of warfare. That's something that we don't necessarily need national militaries trying to deal with, although the lines are often very blurry. But I think when it comes to international efforts, capacity building is absolutely essential, as the example of Ukraine should show. We face a really difficult time as a global community when it comes to building norms and laws and actually finding our way to compliance. So to take the UN ad hoc commission, which is ongoing, this was an effort that was proposed in part by Russia, and there are profound disagreements about just how to define cybercrime, and I think really important concerns that states like Russia and China seek a very broad definition of cybercrime that would enable them to suppress free speech and engage in violations of human rights and political oppression. So I think it's going to be a challenging environment. And one of the most important things we can do is actually to try to have decent relations with other countries so that we can establish, if not, genuine trust, then at least where the red lines are and create effective structures of deterrence. So one of the things that was actually fairly effective was the agreement between the United States and China in 2015 to get China to engage less in cyber espionage. It did have an effect for several years, and then relations took a downward turn for other reasons, and it has less of an effect because there's less of an incentive for compliance as a result. And a year ago, President Biden also reportedly presented Vladimir Putin with a list of 16 areas of critical infrastructure that he said, you must not target this in the United States. So I think, unfortunately, those kinds of hard-nosed deal-making and ultimatums or expressions of where the red lines lie may be in our future, and those will be very important as we try to figure out what are the right kind of partners internationally where we can create effective multilateral cooperation.
Thank you so much for that. We will now turn to the Q&A portion of this conversation, and I'll take advantage of my position here as a moderator to ask the first question, but I believe you can submit your questions online and also write them down and pass them on to me. My question to all of you really is, given this evolution of public-private cooperation, what we have seen in Ukraine in the last 3 months, there is a new IT army comprised entirely of volunteers, and that combines people from 150 countries. These are people with various technical skills who volunteer to be a part of this IT army, and they actually conduct their own counteroffensive operations in Russian networks. What do you think are the threats and opportunities of that new type of a public-private cooperation in which volunteers can is sort of have the free reign to also participate in cyberspace?
You know, the sort of incorporation of hacktivists, not necessarily just the IT army, but there have been a number of different groups, hacktivist groups that have been involved in this conflict on both sides. I think it certainly raises the possibility of sort of a counterattack or somebody misunderstanding or misattributing something. I'll give you an example. Historically, Russia has pretended to be hacktivist groups. The GRU on several occasions has created hacktivist personas in pursuit of their operations. So, for instance, when they first started hitting the Olympics, they pretended to be anonymous. So my concern is that when we are seeing these hacktivist groups, which may be real hacktivists, they may be seeing Western intelligence services, right? There's a real problem there, potential for mirroring bias, and that may actually be growing the likelihood of them retaliating in kind.
So maybe I can add something too on that. You certainly can understand why these groups would want to help the Ukraine and can provide support. But the question is, what kind of support are they providing and what rules are they bound by? If they're acting completely independently and not acting within the supervision, for instance, of the Ukraine or others, they could be targeting things that could be very escalatory. So states are bound or should be bound by certain rules. Everyone agreed in the UN to these norms, including don't attack the critical infrastructure of their country. But those get violated by states. Now, on the other hand, the US response, we're not going to target, the US is not going to target the infrastructure, the civilian infrastructure of Russia. It said this. When that was suggested in a press report, the White House quickly pushed back because we're living by these norms. This is not a proper response. However, these groups could independently do that, and that could cause escalation. And as John said, they could misperceive that as not being a hacktivist group, but a nation state or an intelligence service. So that's dangerous. And I just wanted to add, as the person who helped negotiate the China agreement that was mentioned earlier, yeah, I think that was significant, but it goes back to the point that I mentioned at the outset that has to be tied into the larger geopolitical environment. The reason that was a success was because China felt it was in its interest to reach that agreement and comply. When it was no longer in its interest because the relationship was so bad, compliance stopped. So we have to tie it to these larger things. And then finally, I don't think that defense is winning out over offense yet. I hope that happens at some day. But as several have mentioned, girding defense requires capacity building, and we need to do that all over the world. That needs to be a priority for all of us, not just because of Ukraine, but because of everything in the future we face.
Just to add on this quick point, totally agree with the danger that having a crowdsourcing of warfare is what it is. That anyone can participate whenever they want, after coffee, in between lunch, to effort that they think at that moment is a military one, without clear capacity to differentiate military target and civilian targets. This is very, very problematic. And on top of that, misattribution, as was mentioned before, which can lead to escalation. So I would say if individuals have time and willingness to do something with their skills in the context of this invasion, there's a lot of positive activities that can be done in, for example, helping the humanitarian sector, to be safe and secure. I mean, there's other ways than participating to a denial of services campaign against what is thought at the time a military target of country A or B. So quite concerning with what the way this escalates, and but also to remind that anyone doing this and entering into a realm where they're going to provoke damage or to look into or just to impact a civilian object or civilian person are de facto under international humanitarian law. And it should also be reminded, it's not something that happens for free when it comes to legal responsibility, even for individual that is using infrastructure of the country that is not part of the conflict in the context of this invasion.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question from the audience here pertaining to cryptocurrency and an increase in attacks on cryptocurrency, and whether this particular phenomenon would change cybersecurity landscape and whether it will affect the concept of warfare and the role of states. Whoever wants to address that.
Cryptocurrency has had a dramatic effect on cybersecurity already. It is absolutely motivating. It motivated an entire change overnight in the way that cybercrime operates. For instance, so cybercrime, most of the cyber criminals that we tracked prior to really the rise of cryptocurrency were conducting these really complex fraud operations that were, mostly focused on the financial sector. Cryptocurrency meant that meant that now these adversaries can conduct attacks on everybody, because instead of having to take financial information and go through a complex system to monetize it, all they have to do is gain access to an organization and find some way to turn the screws on them until they pay them in cryptocurrency, which they can then monetize themselves. It changed everything. We saw all these crime fraud operators walk away from their previous business and move into this space. And of course, the same thing happened with North Korea. North Korea has absolutely transformed their own operations around the idea of gaining access to cryptocurrency. And they do that through a number of different schemes, from trying to start their own cryptocurrency to stealing it from exchanges to even some ransomware operations. So it's been massively changed the entire business.
Thank you. Whoever else wants to chime in on this question.
I'll just add really quickly that I think here's an area where there absolutely needs to be a multilateral effort to impose the kinds of checks that we have imposed on the regular financial system. Know your customer checks, anti-money laundering checks. This can be done. I think cryptocurrency is here to stay, despite its recent plunge in value. But I think this is a clear area where action is needed.
Yeah, and I should add that I helped co-chair something called a ransomware task force that came out with a comprehensive report with about 60 people from private industry, former government, et cetera. And on cryptocurrency, as was suggested, we're not going to ban cryptocurrency. It's going to continue to be here, but we do have to do the know your customer rules, the anti-money laundering rules. No one country can do that alone, although the US Treasury has been very active recently on that. It has to be a broader international effort, like we did with the Financial Action Task Force, for instance.
Thank you. We have another question here from the audience, specifically to Mr. Painter and Mr. Dugan. Is public attribution effective deterrence against cyber attacks?
So maybe I'll start, and Stefan can follow up. No, I think it is a predicate, right? I think it's important to do this public attribution. I think it's important for it to be done by a collection of countries, not just one alone. I think it's stronger and has more legitimacy. Attribution is by states at the end of the day a political act, but they don't want to be wrong. They want to make it. They're careful to base it on as much facts as possible. And when the attribution has been made, Russia for NotPetya, North Korea for WannaCry, and a number of others that have been done, including some of the activity in Ukraine, it's been a very thoughtful process. But we'd be kidding ourselves if we say that attribution alone is going to name and shame Russia to change its activity, or North Korea. That's just not going to happen. What it does do is educate our publics, educate our partners that we know what's going on, and it can build further action. And that's what I talked about, the collective responsibility to do. It has to be attribution plus. We don't want to be escalatory, but we want to work together as a community to make sure that we're countering these bad acts. And attribution is a foundation, but not the building.
Yeah, there is to go after, because you said everything. So for the attribution, I would add that it should be done, as Chris was mentioning, as a collective effort, way more. There's still too many campaigns that are just not attributed, but also with the real ambition for quality and the capacity not to go back to the data. So that it's not going to be tagged at some point as a just political process or geopolitical posture, which would be quite problematic. And that's about the difference of the time of attribution, which is not the political time, which is not really in play with sometimes the requirements of the media to know very quickly what is happening about something, because just you don't know, it would be very dangerous to take a position at that moment. To deterrence, not deterrence, take a let's compare attribution effort at state level with other type of linking a attack to an actor in the judicial realm. Or let's look into a recent project that has been put in place to attribute specific usage of spyware, for example, to specific companies that we saw with the NSO and others. So because it's been attributed with a lot of data and written information that it deter to continue the usage of such capabilities. So it's important, it's part of it, but we should not think that this is the alpha and the omega, it's going to solve the problems.
I don't know if any other speakers want to chime in on this question of deterrence, and perhaps I can kind of build a little bit on that as a final conversation point here. Whether, everybody has been anticipating a much larger scale cyber war that we expected Russia to bring on Ukraine, and also, as many speakers have pointed out, a much more intense use of cyber attacks alongside kinetic activity, and it appears that Russia has not launched that major cyber war that everybody anticipated it to. So I'm curious then, to kind of continue this conversation on deterrence, why do you think, do you believe that Russia has been deterred in any way, or is it just a matter of a different sort of tactical choice?
No, I don't think they've been deterred at all. I think they've reached. There's been a ton of major obstacles for them. One, they had no plan, or the plan they did have ultimately failed. So you have to imagine any long-term planning began 2 weeks after the invasion began. Two, they are being actively defended against. The Ukrainians are extremely aggressive in this space. Clearly got a lot of major partners. I have no doubt that they are disrupting Russian operations left and right. And I think that's a big piece of this as well that we have to keep in mind.
Thank you. Does
Yeah,
anybody else
I
want to
agree
chime in?
with John. Yeah, I agree with John. I think that, first of all, given the disorganization when this whole attack was launched, it's not clear the cyber operators even know the physical invasion was coming, or that was certainly married up. The Viasat attack, if that was coupled with a military response, probably would have been more effective. Second, I don't think deterrence, Russia's been deterred. However, I think Russia may have been more cautious in going after Western targets in reprisal for sanctions and other things, because they have a lot on their hands right now. And they are worried about what response right now that might entail. In the future, I think that fear will be allayed, and they're going to start going after those targets as this war unfortunately drags on.
All right, well, thank you very much. And I believe that's all we have time for. Unfortunately, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the audience and to those who submitted questions. I'm sure that this conversation will be continued as we continue dealing with these new security challenges. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of session 1, cybersecurity. And for your information, tomorrow on day 2, we will start off with a special session at 4:30 p.m. Korean Standard Time, followed by session 2, health security at 6:30 p.m. Korean Standard Time. Last but not least, we'd like to have session 3, emerging technologies and security, from 8:10 p.m. Korean Standard Time. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you very much for your participation, and we'd like to have all of our participants tomorrow as well. So this has been Jessica Lee. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you very much.